Thanks, guys. A lot going on in the country, a lot of things you'll remember for the rest of your life. There's a lot of things with riots and protests. There's a lot of racial tensions. There's a lot of things that really are kind of difficult right now. So I want to address some of those from a historical and a biblical standpoint. In doing so, let's just start with America first. And starting with America first and looking at where she is, we are one of 195 nations in the world. Every nation has a government, a form of government. We're one of the 195. The Bible actually identifies 7 different forms of government. The one that we chose was the one that was recommended most often in the Bible out of verses like Exodus 18:21, but we have a republican form of government. Now, what's interesting is out of those 195 nations that all have governments, we wrote our Constitution back in 1787, and so from the time that we've written that Constitution, we've only had one Constitution. Now, that's really unusual with nations. In the same period of time that we've had just one government, look at how often other nations have constitutions. Imagine living in nations that have 20 constitutions or 7. Imagine the instability and turmoil that goes in that nation. Now, we've never experienced that. We don't even know how to imagine it because we haven't been through the number of revolutions that other nations have. Last year, I was in Poland with some congressmen, had a congressional delegation there. I talked to people living in Poland that in their lifetime, they have lived through 7 different constitutions. As it turns out, the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. Well, this year, last week and a half ago, we celebrated 233 years under the same document. So we're blessed in ways that we don't even recognize. And one of the interesting things about being blessed is you don't know you've been blessed until you lose your blessings. And so one of the blessings we have is stability. We have not had to worry about revolutions and conflicts in the same way that other nations do. A nation averages a violent revolution every generation. So if you lived in an average nation outside of America, at some point in your life, you would experience a violent revolution that might cost you your life, might cost your family, your friends, whatever. That's common across the world, and a new constitution every 17 years. We don't have that. In addition to not having that, we have a creativity that's unrivaled. America is a small nation. We have only 4% of the world's population. But when you look at creativity, and that can be measured by copyright or patent protection or other things, America, we produce 96% of all the inventions of the world. All the medical discoveries, all the technological finds, all the things that are done with science, all the things that are done with agriculture, 96% of the world's inventions come out of this little 4% of the population. So we are way blessed, way beyond other people. I was in Germany last year. I do a lot of things at American military bases, and there's 28 military bases in Germany, so I was over talking at some of those bases, and I got to stay in a 5-star German hotel. Now, I'm a cowboy from Texas, which means that I'm used to kind of a much different level of lifestyle than staying at a 5-star hotel, which is the best there is. And in Germany, which is one of those old nations with castles and everything else, it's a super cool nation, except in their 5-star hotels, they didn't even have the internet. In every hotel we got today, whether it's even Motel 6, we've all got internet. So we have technology, we have things available to us that most of the world does not experience. It's the same thing even with our prosperity. We are only 4% of the world's population. We produce 25% of the world's gross domestic product. That's an economic measurement. What happens is if you live in poverty in America, according to the Census Bureau, and we don't want anyone living in poverty in America, but if you do, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe. So imagine that. Poverty in America is higher than middle class in Europe. As a matter of fact, in states like Hawaii, states like Mississippi, they're literally told that if you can't make more than $68,000 a year, you should not come off welfare. So welfare pays higher than middle class in nearly everything. Being poor in America is better than being middle class in the rest of the world. So we're blessed in so many different ways. This is a term that's called American exceptionalism. That was a title given to us back in 1831. A guy named Alexis de Tocqueville came here from France, wrote a book about America. It's called Democracy in America. He said, America, this is exceptional. I don't think any other nation will be able to do what they've done. Now, that's not a term of arrogance. It's just a term pointing out that we are doing things that are the exception, not the rule. It's the exception, not the rule, for a nation to have 233 years under the Constitution. It's an exception, not the rule, for us to have all the creativity, all the productivity. So it's not a matter of being arrogant and saying, I'm a proud American. It's just a matter that we have blessings here that other nations have not experienced. So when you look at that, who's responsible for that? And invariably, in a lot of history textbooks, and I do a lot of work with history across the nation, been appointed a bunch of states to write the history and social studies standards in those states. Invariably, when we look at things that we would call political, like economics and technology, et cetera, so many times we look to political leaders. So we'll look back and say, well, George Washington, he helped found the country. He's responsible for us being different. And you've also got folks like John Hancock, and you got folks like John Adams, and all those are good names. They had a lot to do with America becoming a unique kind of nation. But what's interesting was when John Adams was an old man, after he'd been in the American Revolution, it's like 40-something years later, there's a young man named Hezekiah Niles who said, I'm writing a history book about America. Now, I'm young. I didn't go through the revolution. I really like what we have in America today, but I don't know how it came to be. You were there. You saw it. So would you tell me who you think are the most important people in helping America become a unique, different nation? And so John Adams, who had been there, who certainly was part of one of those leaders, he said, well, if you want to know, you've got folks like the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, who's a preacher. He said you've got the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. He mentioned the Reverend George Whitefield. He mentioned the Reverend Charles Johnson. He starts to go through and listing preachers and Christians. Now, that's not who we list in textbooks today, but John Adams, who saw it, these are the guys he called out. And it wasn't just white preachers, it was black preachers like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and folks like John Morant. You just heard some of John Morant, Lemuel Haynes, Harry Hoosier. I mean, these are the guys that back in the day they looked to and said, America's different because of the Christian leaders, particularly from the pulpit, who helped found America. Now, that's not something we would say today. We wouldn't go around and say, look at all the pastors that have made America so different. But back in the day, we did. Pastors in church and Christians took a very different, a very active role. Let me just take Harry Hoosier for a minute. Harry Hoosier, very interesting guy. He had been a slave. He gets his freedom. He becomes a Christian. He memorizes most of the Bible, and he starts traveling with an evangelist known as Francis Asbury. Now, Francis Asbury is a guy that was a Methodist evangelist. He went across the nation sharing the gospel. He rode 300,000 miles on horseback. So that's like going around the world 12 times on horseback, which is what he rode, but it was all in America. So what happens is Francis Asbury has these huge crowds, and he has Harry Hoosier come preach with him. And so it starts out that Harry is preaching to the black folk and that Francis is preaching to the white folk. But pretty soon the white folk want to go hear Harry. And so Harry's got bigger crowds than Francis Asbury does. And Francis talked about how that's a great deal, that Harry's got such big crowds. As a matter of fact, Benjamin Rush, who's a signer of the Declaration, said, I've heard Harry preach. He's the best orator I've ever heard. Now, he had heard guys like Patrick Henry and John Hancock and others. He said, no, the best guy I've ever heard is Harry Hoosier. Now, it's interesting. Harry Hoosier spent a lot of time in ministering to and converting what we would call the blue-collar kind of folks. They were the hard workers. They were the working class. These were guys that were frontiersmen. They weren't your traditional kind of white-collar guys. These were guys that lived a rougher life. And so Harry spent a lot of time ministering to them. But what happened is these guys became Christians, and their life changed and started to conform their Bible. Their lifestyle was different. People saw that. So these guys who he had preached to out in eastern Pennsylvania, they started moving west because they're mountain men. They're going where the frontier is. And as people are starting to move west in America in those years, they moved west too. And they ended up in the place that we now call Indiana. Now, it's interesting that they were known as Hoosiers, because what happened is when they got there, the other mountain men said, these guys are really kind of different. They don't act the way we do. What's the deal with them? They said, oh, they're a bunch of Hoosiers. In other words, they were converts of Harry Hoosier. They became Christians. Their lifestyle was really different. And I'll bet you most people who live in Indiana today have no clue that they're named after a black evangelist, but they are. So this is a big deal in history, except we just don't talk about this kind of stuff anymore. So in addition to people like Harry Hoosier, you have John Morant. You heard the story of John Morant. He was converted by George Whitefield. George Whitefield helped him find Christ. And then after that, he goes out in the woods and he finds that Indian friend, and the two of them hang together for about 12, 13 weeks. Then they go to the village, and at the village, the chief sees John and orders him to be put to death. And so in the process of that thing of being put to death, which is a very barbarous type of death they had planned, you heard some of what they were doing, little slivers of pitch pine that were filled with turpentine. They drive it into the body, and then they light them, set it on fire, and after they roasted them one side, they would roll them over and do the other side. They would burn him to death, but very slowly, very painfully. So as he's awaiting death, he starts praying in that hut that night, and he's praying to Jesus, And the guard outside says, who are you talking to? I'm talking to Jesus. I don't see Jesus. Jesus is here with me. So the guard gets converted, then eventually the executioner gets converted, then the chief gets converted. And so the chief says, I've got all these other neighboring tribes around that need to hear what you've shared with us. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my top 50 warriors, my own personal bodyguard, and I'm sending them with you. Because when you get to those other tribes, they're going to treat you just like we did. They're going to try to kill you. So I'm sending you my 50 best warriors to go with you. And for the next 2 years, John traveled with those 50 warriors and went from tribe to tribe. John spoke to the Cherokee, the Cadasar, the Hausar, the Creek, so many others. And he's 14 years old at the time. He's the first Black American successfully to evangelize Native Americans. Now, he did this. It started when he was 13. When he was 14 is when he finished 2 years of ministry. His story is a really cool story. It's in a 1785 book that you can get on Google Books. It's free. It's only about 35 pages long, but it's really cool. This is from 1785. This is at the end of the American Revolution. He's talking about the next phase in his ministry, telling the story of how he became a Christian, what happened. So really cool guy that we rarely hear about today, but he is a substantial figure in history. We also have guys like Lemuel Haynes. He's the first black man in America to have a degree of higher education. As a preacher, it's interesting. This is actually a painting of him back in the day in the 1700s. And if you look at that black preacher, you'll notice that he's got an all-white church, which doesn't seem to be the narrative we hear today, that America was founded on racism, has racism. America has racism, no question about it, but that was not the only story that was there. That's the story of much of what happened in the South. Much of what happened in the North was biblical leaders recognized equality, that the Bible says there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female. We're all equal in Christ. And so that's a different story, but we rarely talk about that side of the story today. So Lemuel Haynes, in addition to being a great pastor of white churches, several white churches, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, other places, he was also the first guy to have a sermon printed. This is a sermon that was printed back in the day, so he's the first black man to have a sermon printed. And in addition to that, he's also a soldier. He was in the American Revolution. He was one of the famous Minutemen in the Revolution. And as a soldier who had fought under George Washington, in his church, on George Washington's birthday, he would preach sermons about George Washington, his commander-in-chief with whom he had served. So here you have this black patriot who fought in the American Revolution, who is a breakthrough kind of guy, again, the first black man to receive a degree of higher education. And by the way, we own his Bible. We own so many old things from back in the day. If you ever get to Texas and want to come by our library, a lot of fun stuff there, a lot of original black history stuff that we own in American Revolution, and World War I and World War II, etc. So Lemuel Haynes is a very significant, very substantial figure. Let me jump you into the American Revolution for a bit. One of the first things that kind of starts the American Revolution is in April of 1775 with that midnight ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere makes this ride to alert the Patriots that the British are coming, except he wasn't the only guy that made that ride. There were about 200 different Patriots that made rides throughout the Revolution doing that Paul Revere kind of thing. One of the guys who made that ride is a guy named Wentworth Cheswell. Now, Wentworth Cheswell, again, is a name we don't recognize today, but he was a black man that was elected to office in 1768. Wentworth Cheswell made one of those famous midnight rides warning the Patriots that the British are coming. So he's elected to office in 17, and by the way, I love that image that we often don't see today of you got black patriots and white patriots all have the same objective, all have the same goal. They all worked and cooperated together in so many of the colonies. Now, it wasn't that way in the South necessarily, but it was in all the northern colonies, and that's where about 85% of the population was. It was mostly up north, and the problem we have today is we look at the 15% and think that's the way it was for the 100%. It's not. What was the 15% was the 15%. What was the 85% is quite different. So he's part of that northern kind of story that we rarely hear today. So Wentworth Cheswell, in making this ride, he was elected to office in New Hampshire in 1768. This is when he was a judge. He actually held 8 different political positions, and over the course of 49 years was elected and reelected and reelected, and again, 8 different political positions. So that's fairly substantial. This is one of your early black leaders in America elected to office, and people today think, well, there were no blacks elected to office until after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. No. There were blacks elected to office in 1641 in Maryland and New Hampshire. Here, I'm going to show you others as we go through. So this is part of the story that we rarely hear today. But Wentworth Cheswell, in addition to being the patriot he was also a great historian. He's the guy who collected the history for New Hampshire, 3-volume set. I actually have that 3-volume set that he wrote on the history of New Hampshire, provided the materials for that. So great guy. So Paul Revere is making this ride. So as Paul Revere Revere makes his ride, he's actually looking for two guys. He's got to find John Hancock and Sam Adams, because the British have put out an order that says all the rest of the patriots you can forgive, but not these two. You find these two, you execute them. The order actually said, I want you to bring back to me the bodies of Hancock and Adams. I want these guys dead when they get back to me. And so what happens is Paul Revere is looking for them to warn them that the British are sending out, actually start with 700 troops, it goes up to 1,400 troops coming after these two guys. And so as the British troops go out, they're looking for these two, but they're also looking for guns and ammunition to take that away from the Patriots. So they're going to Lexington and Concord, etc., looking for guns and ammunition to take that. And so as Hancock is looking for these two guys, he knows exactly where they stay, and that was at the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. The Reverend Jonas Clark was the preacher of the church in Lexington. And so Hancock gets word there, and when Revere gets word to Hancock and Adams, and when they get word there at Reverend Clark's house that the British are coming for you guys, and they're coming to Lexington to take your guns and ammunition, at that point, Hancock and Adams turned to Pastor Clark and said, Pastor, are you guys ready for this? He said, of course they are. He said, I've trained them for this very moment. So the next morning, the alarm bells went off because the British came to town, and it resulted in what was known as the Battle of Lexington. Now, what most people don't recognize is it was the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark. It was 70 guys from his church that went out to face 700 British. So it wasn't a very even battle by any means, but these guys were willing to step out and face the enemy wherever it was. A lot of courage there. And at the end of that battle, you had white patriots like John Roberts laying on the ground and black patriots like Prince Estabrook. They all went to church together. Again, this is the northern view of history. We rarely get blacks and whites going to church together. There are 18 guys out of the 70 that were shot and laying on the ground at the end of that battle. So after that battle, and by the way, they all came out of the same church. So again, they're all going to church together. After that battle, the British then go further to the west, and they get to the North Bridge at Concord. When they get the North Bridge, and by the way, Prince Estabrook, I forgot to mention Prince Estabrook, back in that day, they built monuments to him like this one, and even today we're still building monuments to him, and very few people have ever heard his name, even though we've got monuments to this guy. He's just a guy we don't cover. And see, if we knew this part of our history, if we knew the role that all colors had played in forming America, we wouldn't have the kind of racial tensions we do today. But what happened in 1902, a guy who wrote history books named Woodrow Wilson came out with a 5-volume set of the history of the American people. And in his history book, he took out every single black person from American history. Even guys like Frederick Douglass, who are huge names, they're all gone out of his textbook. And so that's the way we've gotten history through much of the 20th century. We really don't get a lot of the heroes we used to have. So Prince Estabrook, well, after they leave Lexington, they go on to other places at Concord and have battles there, etc. And they finally get back around to coming back to Boston. And when they get back to Boston, that's where we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, this is a painting by John Trumbull. He made sure that off to the side you could see the heroes of the battle. Now, right there you see the black guy. He's standing right there beside a white guy. Black guy is Prince Salem, white guy is David Grosvenor. Now, these guys off to the side is significant that Peter Salem is the hero of the battle. He's credited with saving countless American lives that day. After the battle, they gave him 12 military commendations. All of his commanders said, this is the great guy. They took him to the commander-in-chief. So he was a hero back in the day, and he was a hero in textbooks throughout. As a matter of fact, this is a textbook from the 1840s, and it talks about the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is part of our history. And you got Peter Salem off there to the side. Make sure you see him. Here's the hero of the battle right there. As you get into the 1870s and 1880s, now we've got color paintings in the textbooks, and we've still got Peter Salem there. He's the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. So for all these generations, we knew who these heroes were. And then again, after about 1902, they're all kind of lost to us. So this is kind of like, I've never heard this stuff before. But Salem Poor was another black guy that day who also got huge military commendations. He was probably the second hero of the battle. So Peter Salem and Salem Poor, two black heroes of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Again, worthy of recognition. We just don't cover them much today. In December of 1776 is when they made the famous crossing of the Delaware. As George Washington crossed the Delaware, we don't recognize many of the people in the boat with him, including guys like Prince Whipple, black patriot who served throughout the Revolution, also Oliver Cromwell. It's interesting that in the American Revolution, the average term of enlistment was 6 months. And so most white soldiers served 6 months and were gone. Most black soldiers re-enlisted and served a total of 4.5 years, actually 9 times longer than most white soldiers did. They just kept re-enlisting and kept fighting for freedom, fighting for the country. And so these are guys, Peter Salem, Prince Whipple, and Oliver Cromwell were guys that fought throughout the Revolution, had those long terms of re-enlistment. They kept re-upping. Then you move into July of 1777. This is to me, one of the most fun stories in the American Revolution. At that point in time, this guy right here, Charles Lee, is our second in command in America. George Washington's commander-in-chief, and Charles Lee is second in command, and he gets himself captured by the British. Now, how do you get him back from the British? Well, the only way you're going to get back in that day was to have a prisoner exchange, which means you got to trade someone of equal value for your second in command, which means we need the British second in command. Now, the British second in command was a guy named Richard Prescott. So if we can capture Richard Prescott, we can switch him for Charles Lee and get our second in command back. How do you do that? Because the problem was General Prescott was sitting in Rhode Island on an island in the middle of the harbor. The entire British Navy of the northern side was around the island. They had a fort, a garrison on the island, and he's sitting in the middle of that garrison. So how are you going to, number one, we didn't have a Navy at that point, so trying to get across the harbor to fight the British Navy, which is the greatest in the world, and then get past the British Navy to get to the garrison, and then get inside the garrison to get the general, it's going to be a hard deal. And so what happens, a guy named Colonel William Barton came up with a plan. He said, I think I've got a plan that might work. It's probably going to get us all killed, but it's the only thing I can think of. And so he said, this plan is so difficult that I'm only going to take volunteers. Now, this is really kind of the beginning of what we would call special forces. These were elite guys, and they had to volunteer for it because this really is a suicide mission. And so there were a total of 40 guys that volunteered for it, 20 white guys, 20 black guys. And so these 40 guys get together, and the guy who became their leader is a guy named Jack Sisson. He took the front lead in the front boat, and so as they go out, they say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to row out in the harbor in rowboats, maybe midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. British will probably all be asleep. They don't expect an attack. So we'll go out there, and what they did is they rowed toward the boats. They took their rowboats with the oars, and they put cloth on the end of the oars. They called it mufflers. It was as they rowed, it didn't splash the water and pop. It was real quiet. So they rowed right under all the British Navy. British Navy's sound asleep, didn't hear anything going on. They get to the island, and at the garrison, the fort is not expecting anything to happen because they got the Navy out there to protect them. So these guys went on to the island and knocked out all the British guards and sentries there. Once they knocked out all the sentries, they then located where Prescott was, but General Prescott is sleeping in the middle of a barricaded door. It's got a bar on the back, it's got iron hinges, it is a thick oak door, and if they have to beat that door down, they're going to wake up everybody in the fort and wake up everybody on the ships. And so at that point, wondering what to do, Jack Sisson said, I got this, get out of my way. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever seen Princess Bride. That's a fun movie. If you remember this one scene out of Princess Bride, that was Jack Sisson. Jack Sisson said, got it, out of my way. He backed up down the hall. He charged the door with his body. He lowered his head, lowered his shoulder, hit the door, popped it off the hinges, broke the bar on the back, went inside. Colonel Prescott pops up in bed and said, what just happened? At that point, Jack Sisson walks over to him, knocks him on the chin, out cold, picks him up and puts him under one arm and walks out with him. And so under one arm, walks out with him, sticks him in the boat, they row back across. Now they've got the second in command, and they have this prisoner exchange where they get their second in command. One of the greatest commando stories ever, and it's just not told anymore today. It's just completely gone. But Jack Sisson, what a great hero he was. Again, kind of the beginning of special forces in American military. You've got 1781, another really fun story. In 1781, this is when General Marquis de Lafayette, 19-year-old general who came to help America, George Washington loved him, adopted him like a son. Marquis de Lafayette is standing with this guy here. Now, often I'll put that picture up and say, who is that black guy? And they say, oh, that's his slave. No, Marquis de Lafayette, huge anti-slavery. He did not like slavery, didn't want slavery, but that is one of his best friends. This guy's name is James Armistead. Now, James Armistead, a fun thing about James Armistead is, you can see the picture of him here, he was really wanting to help America in some way. And so he talked to General Lafayette and said, what can I do to help? And General Lafayette said, well, George Washington has tasked me with finding out what the British are doing. Because the problem we have is we don't know what the British Army does until they do it. So if they plan a surprise attack, we get surprised because we didn't know it was coming. There's no forewarning. George Washington wants me to go get intelligence ahead of time on what the British are doing, which means we got to put spies in the British camp. And spies back then, you didn't do much with spies because that wasn't very dignified, and so you didn't have many spies. But James said, I'll do that. I'll go in the British camp. And Lafayette says, no, you don't understand. This is really dangerous. If you get caught, that's death. He says, yeah, I know, but I want to do something to help. And so what happens is James goes straggling into the British camp saying, oh, I hate the Americans. They so mistreat me. It's so bad. Will you kind British please take me in? And the British say, sure. You want to come join us? That's great. And so James in the British camp starts faithfully serving all the officers, does everything he can to help them, get them water, get them drinks, get them their clothes, get them anything. And he's serving all these officers, and it grabs the attention of some of the officers, including a general by the name of Benedict Arnold. Now, if you know Benedict Arnold, he was an American general who became a traitor, and he became a British general. Well, Benedict Arnold is meeting with Cornwallis, the commander of all the British forces on a daily basis, because all the generals meet with the commander-in-chief. And so Benedict Arnold says, James, you are such a great guy in serving. Why don't you just come serve me? And he says, okay, I'll do that. So James is now with Benedict Arnold, hearing the plan of every battle, the plan of every sneak attack, the plan of everything that's going on. And so as he's there with him, he's with Cornwallis. Well, Cornwallis eventually sends Benedict Arnold out on another mission, and so that leaves James behind at camp. And at that point in time, Cornwallis goes to James, not knowing he's a spy. He goes to James and said, James, you've served Benedict Arnold so great. Would you serve me as well? He said, be happy to. So now you have James Armistead hearing everything from the commander-in-chief, knows everything the British are doing, and every night he's getting word back to Lafayette or back to George Washington, here's what the British are about to do. And suddenly the British aren't winning things like they used to. Suddenly the sneak attacks aren't working. We're ready for them. We're not even there when they get there. They thought we were. And so what happens is Lord Cornwallis calls in James and says, James, we've got a spy in the camp. And James says, oh my gosh. He says, I don't know who it is, but we got to find out who it is. He said, I know you hate the Americans. I know this is going to be a tough assignment, but I'm going to ask you, would you be willing to be a spy for us and go spy on the Americans and tell me what's going on? And James says, oh, I hate the Americans. Yeah, I'll do it for you. And so he becomes the first double spy in American history. He actually feeds all the bad information to Cornwallis, feeds all the good information to Washington and Lafayette, and that's really the reason we won the Battle of Yorktown where we did. Lafayette acknowledged the fact that James came up with the information that helped them pin the British at Yorktown and in the American Revolution. So in the American Revolution, we rarely talk about James Armistead. Again, first double spy in American history, but it's like the beginning of military intelligence. I mean, there's so many breakthrough things that happened in the American Revolution that have great heroes. And by the way, Hollywood is in the midst of making 2 movies about James Armistead that should be coming out. I've seen both scripts, looking over the scripts. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with that, because this is a great action movie. I mean, what happened with James Armistead. So 1793, this is a newspaper out of Pennsylvania. This newspaper, if you can see the date up top, 1793, says, in the borough of Easton, Pennsylvania, a free Negro man of the name of Thomas Hercules was on the 6th day of July last chosen town clerk of that borough by a decided majority of votes. This we mention as proof of the growing liberality of the present age, when virtue and worth alone, and not mere color or trickery of rank and splendor, begin to recommend a man to place of trust and confidence. In other words, in a very white city, we just elected a black guy as our town clerk, and we didn't do it because of his color or because of our color. We did it because he's the most competent guy out there. Now see, this is what went on in a lot of the northern states, but this is not what BLM is aware of. It's not what the 1619 Project is aware of. They're aware of what happened in southern history, and that's where the racism is so prevalent, and they think that's the whole picture of America, and it's not. There's a whole side to America that we just haven't heard in a long time, and there's great heroes there. So when you look at race in America, it's interesting that according to science, just a couple of years ago, National Geographic, other scientific groups got together and they made some breakthrough discoveries in DNA. And when they look at DNA, it's interesting what they said. Looking at DNA testing results, they said that all races share 99.99% plus of the same genetic material, which means that a division of race is largely subjective. From a scientific standpoint, what you are on the outside means very little. It's what your composition is, and we all are very alike. As a matter of fact, as they pointed out, they said that not only is a division of race largely subjective, they said, but based on DNA, any white guy in America has more in common with LeBron James. Any white guy in America has more in common with LeBron James than do two identical giraffes, twins, have in common with each other. In other words, identical twins anywhere in nature, they have less in common than a white guy and a black guy that are both human, which is amazing. That I've got more in common with LeBron James than two twin giraffes have with each other. But see, that's what DNA is. But again, we get caught up on the outside, not the inside. Science itself says race is largely non-existent. It's subjective because we're all 99.99% plus the same. So literally, that division of race is subjective. That's the way we should think. And that, by the way, is the biblical way to think. If you're aware of what the Bible says in Acts 17:26, the scripture says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. We all came from one thing, and that was something they found about 12 years ago. DNA, as they were getting into it, they said, because all humans are so closely alike, it is very clear that there was a human parent at some point in time. We did not come through any other species. There was a human parent. They didn't know what to call it. We call it Adam and Eve, but they didn't know what to call it. And they said, man can't be over 100,000 years old. I mean, just DNA is real clear on that. There was a human parent. So that's what the Bible told us. And he made from one man every nation, every race of man to live on the face of the earth. So we're all related in some way. I was speaking in a black church not long ago, huge black church, about 6,000 people. I'm the only white guy in the building. And I looked at everybody and said, you guys may not be aware of this. I am your cousin. You just don't know that because we all come from Adam. And coming from Adam, there's 150 generations since Adam, so I'm your 150th cousin. That's because he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face. See, this is where you get the right view of equality. It's because of what God did. It's not because we have to learn to tolerate and put up with each other. You get a right view of what God did and making us all equal and understanding that race is subjective. And that's actually what he also tells us in 1 Samuel 16:7. The Lord looks not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance. The Lord looks on the heart. See, we're all concerned about the outside. He's concerned about the inside. So when God looks on the heart, it turns out that there's only two really races in the Bible, if you want to call them races, and race isn't the right term, but there's only two groups in the Bible, and those two groups are those that know God and those that don't know God. And that's the only distinction he makes. It's not what's on the outside, it's what's on the heart. You know him, you follow him, you obey him, or you don't know him, you don't follow him, you don't obey him. That's the distinctions he makes, not between any race or color or anything else. So if America knew more about that today, if we had more of a biblical worldview, there'd be a whole lot less in the way of racial tensions and other things going. And this is not to say that bad stuff didn't happen with race in America. It did. I've got so much of the bad stuff that happened in our collection, our library. There is so much that's bad, but there's so much that's good as well. And it's the good that we rarely hear. So going with this for a minute, as I mentioned this piece right there, let me get into some things that deal with modern view today. The modern view of racism today is largely white on black. We hear a lot about white privilege. If you're white, you're privileged in a way that no other people are. That's not true. You're privileged in a way that some people in the South weren't, but people elsewhere, there was very different treatment, as you saw, even with the elections and other things. So the relationship today between whites and blacks has much to do with our historical view of slavery. So in closing out this first session this morning, I want to give you 8 things you should know about the history of slavery. Those 8 things, they're important things to know. Start with the first one, and that is that racism is a sin. Everybody agree with that? Any trouble with that? Okay. To say racism is a sin also says something else. If it's a sin, then it affects all races. It's not just whites that have racism. Any race can, and every race does. Because what happens with racism, I mean, there's just so many examples. You don't have just white sins or just Hispanic sins or just black sins or just female sins. Sin is sin. It affects people. And so wherever there is sin, it's going to affect all people. And so there's examples of this in so many places. Rwanda 10 years ago had the civil war they had where 1 million were killed. The Tutsis and the Hutus fought each other. Now, they're both black, but you're the wrong black. And so I've got to wipe out your race of black because you're not ours. If we were all the same color, if we were all black, or if we were all red, or if we were all brown, whatever, we would still find a way to make distinctions, because you got blue eyes and I got brown eyes and he's got green eyes, and we would still find a way to do something different. And so that's what happened even with Rwanda. 1 million killed, hacked to death by machetes. They fought each other largely with machetes. And so hack each other to death because you're the wrong black. Racism is not just a white on black phenomenon. It exists every nation, every race, every people. It is a sin problem. And so that's one of the things to understand. It affects all human beings. So the first thing to understand is slavery is barbaric and inhumane. There's no way of saying that slavery was a good deal. It wasn't. Now, slavery is part of the progression. I'll show you in the next session how the slavery actually was an improvement from what used to happen, because in the age of conquest, you either killed or you enslaved everybody. Well, since you killed everybody, when they started enslaving you instead, at least you got to remain alive. So being a slave was better than being killed, because in the age of conquest, they killed all their enemies, wiped them all out, exterminated them. And then they started saying, well, let's not kill them all, let's make some slaves. Well, slavery was a better deal than being killed. So that was a progression, but that's not where we need to be, is in slavery. So Christ brings liberty. We got out of that. Largely everywhere slavery has ended in the world, it's been Christians that were behind that. Christians that pushed it, Christians who had a biblical worldview. Everyone who really did not have a biblical worldview, they're more into slavery and owning someone else and seeing distinctions. So all the pictures I can show you, by the way, this one on the right, you probably all have scars from something that's happened somewhere, but I bet none of you have scars that stand up a half-inch tall. How many times do you think that guy had to be beat to get scars that big? And how bad were the beatings to get scars that tall? That's barbaric stuff. Well, see, that's part of what was going on with slavery. And this is what you would see particularly out of Southern slavery and Southern treatment. As I pointed out, it's quite different in the North, and that's why we even had a civil war over the deal. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is America was not a world leader in the global slave trade. The global slave trade ran out of Africa from 1501 to about 1875, so about 374 years. In that period of time, 12 million Africans were taken out of Africa and voluntarily into slavery. About 2 million of them died in transit. About 10.5 million made their destinations. But it's interesting to see where the destinations were. I had a college professor recently telling students that America took 12.7 million out of Africa to bring to America. Nope, not even close. The records are very clear. They have records of every known slave ship, how many started the trip, how many ended, because it's cargo, it's money. They kept records of what they did with money. So we know how many slaves there were. We know the names of the slave ships. We know where they're bound, their destination. And what you find is that all of those that came out of Africa, 43% went to Portugal and Brazil. You had 24% that went to Great Britain. You had 15% to Spain, 11% to France, 5% to the Dutch, 2.5% to America, and 1% to Denmark. Now, America is not one of the highest offending nations. We're one of the lowest. That doesn't mean that was an excuse for having 300,000 slaves come to America, but out of the 12.7 million, we're way down the list. So how is it that America gets blamed for all the slavery in the world today? We were way down the list on that. And significantly, these are seven swords that we just obtained, and these are all swords from nations in Africa where blacks use these against other blacks to capture them and sell them into the slave trade. Because what happened was tribes in Africa, this is a way to make money. We'll sell them to the Muslim slave traders, who sell them to the Portuguese, who sell them to the Dutch, who sell them to everybody else, who haul to other places. So it was very much blacks enslaving blacks for the sake of profit to be able to do that. These are swords out of the Congo, out of Zanzibar, out of different places. These are all tribal swords that were used in the African slave trade, which largely, again, was blacks enslaving other blacks to sell to Muslims, to sell to other nations. So that was the African slave trade. So it was a global condition. Now, having said that, are you aware of the fact that America was the first nation in the world to ban the slave trade? No nation banned the slave trade before we did. We did it in March of 1807. So think about that. Nobody was banning the slave trade until 1807, which means that over the 5,800 years of the world, slavery was accepted for 5,600 years. It's only been in the last 200 years that we've started turning against it, and America was the first one to do so. So we're the first one to do that in 1807. Then after we did that in 1807, we actually created a squadron of naval ships from 1819 to 1861 that set off the coast of Africa to stop any other slave ship from any other nation from getting to Africa. We tried to shut down the global slave trade. Instead of just saying, well, it's us in America, we're going to do what we can do, we went in and said, no, we're going to try to stop slavery everywhere else in the world. And so we put a naval squadron. It was called the African Squadron. We joined with Great Britain, who had what was called the West African Squadron, and America and Great Britain tried to keep any other nations from being able to take slaves out of Africa. Then America becomes and this is part of that squadron. You see the American flag on the right. They would stop slaving ships like that on the left. This is actually a cargo of slaves that was rescued in 1904. Again, the British and the Americans were working together, but 1904, this is a cargo of slaves rescued off a ship in 1904. So America was the fourth nation in the world to ban slavery. We did so in 1865. Great Britain was first in 1833. Then you had Denmark, and then France, and then America. So think about that. That's only 150 years ago, and we're the fourth nation in the world to ban slavery out of 124 nations. We're way ahead of the rest of the world. So for America to be the source of all the evils on racism, that doesn't make any sense. We were one of the first groups in the world to start trying to do things right. Great Britain was number one, but we were four. So those are things to recognize. But out of the 195 nations we have in the world today, I mentioned this earlier, 195 nations today, as we sit here, there are still 94 nations that have not banned slavery and made it illegal in their nation. 94 nations today still have not criminalized slavery. So as a result, as we sit here right now, there are 40 million active slaves in the world today. Now, in 374 years, it's 12.7 million. There's 400 million. Africa today has 9.2 million slaves. There's more slavery in Africa than any time in the history of the slave trade. I actually help run a group that's considered the most active group in the world in rescuing slaves, and we don't just rescue them in the orthodox ways. We go into auctions. For example, I can buy a slave in India for $60, and we can buy girls out of sex slavery for $60, get them into freedom. So we buy slaves, not because we support slavery, because we want people to be free from it. Also in the Middle East, when ISIS went in and started conquering Christians and other minorities, Yazidis, and made sex slaves out of them and made straight slaves out of them. So we would go in and take slaves away from ISIS. We actually hire Kurds. Kurds are Muslims who hate ISIS, who like Christians, and we actually hire Kurds to go in and fight ISIS and get the slaves out and bring them out. We take slaves, we send former slaves to Australia. Australia takes everyone we can send them. We're able to send them to Canada. We send them all around the world. We've had 2 of our guys killed in fighting ISIS to get the slaves away. One of our guys has been shot 17 times, and he keeps going back to save slaves. Slavery is real today. It's as real today as it's ever been in the history of the world, just nobody talks about it. 40 million. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the 195 nations, those that are taking the most action against slavery and racism, Netherlands is number 1, the United States is number 2. So we're actually doing more than the rest of the world except for Netherlands, and somehow we're all convinced that America needs to feel really, really, really guilty. Well, we did some things wrong, no question about it. But compared to the rest of the nations in the world, oh my gosh, we're at least trying to move in the right direction. So these are all stats that are important. Number 3 thing to know is Jamestown. Now, the 1619 Project you may have heard about says that slavery started in America in 1619. That's not true. In 1619, there were a number of indentured slaves, a number of slaves who came ashore. They were not slaves. They were slaves taken off. We captured a slave ship. So we brought the 19 slaves off that slave ship ashore. They then became indentured servants. Indentured servants means that if you'll work for 7 years to pay off the expense we put into you, you get freedom and we'll give you land. You get your own land and you can be whatever you want to be, a business person, farmer, whatever. And so one of the indentured servants who became free and owned his own land was a guy named Anthony Johnson, black guy. Anthony Johnson became very prosperous, got 250 acres of land. He was so prosperous, he started sponsoring other indentured servants. Now, the way indentured servants work, it's like a loan. If I want to go, SpaceX, take me to Mars for $1 million. If I want to go to Mars for $1 million, I can't afford that. But what I'll do is I'll say, SpaceX, if you'll take me to Mars for $1 million, I think my labor is worth about $50,000 a year. So if I work for you 20 years, That would pay off $1 million. So you guys front the $1 million, and for the next 20 years, I'll work for you. You won't pay me anything. That's what an indenture was. I don't have enough money to go to the new world, but if you'll pay for my passage over there, $10,000, whatever it is, I'll work for you for the next 7 years. And so an indentured servant they made a loan with themselves as collateral. They said, I'll go work for 7 years if you'll pay my way, and then I'll be free, and then I'll get to have land or whatever. And that's what Anthony Johnson did. So he started sponsoring indentured servants. They would come over, they would work for him. After 7 years, he would give them land, they would be free, except one guy. He had one black guy that he said was so lazy and so worthless that what happened was in 1651, Anthony Johnson went to court and said to the court, this guy right here, this black guy right here, he is so worthless and lazy, he won't pay off what I put into him in 7 years. I'm asking you to let me own him for the rest of his life. It'll take the rest of his life. He's so lazy to pay off what he owes me. So I want to own him for the rest of his life. And the court said, that's fine, you can do that. So the first case of slavery in America, chattel slavery, where you actually own someone, lock, stock, and barrel, was 1651, and it occurred when a black man sued to own another black man. So that's the start of slavery in America, not 1619 like the 1619 Project says, 1651. Number 4 to know is free blacks as slave owners. It's interesting that when you look at blacks in the South, blacks elsewhere, Carter Woodson is known as the father of black history. He examined the 1830 U.S. Census and found that according to the 1830 U.S. Census, what you had was 43% of blacks, free blacks in South Carolina owned black slaves. Imagine that. Nearly half the free blacks in South Carolina, a slave state, owned black slaves. You had the same thing with Louisiana at 40%, Mississippi 26%, Alabama 25%, Georgia 20%. So black on black slavery was not uncommon in America. Now, it wasn't as common as white on black slavery. Certainly there were more whites and therefore more slaves, but black on black slavery occurred because remember, slavery is a sin. It affects every group, every race, which leads us to point number 5. See all these Native Americans? There are some unusual faces with those Native Americans. Notice that? Why are all these black faces with Native Americans? Because Native Americans were the highest percentage of slave owner in America. And actually, in the 1860 census, out of the 5 major tribes that were in America, 12%, 1 out of every 8 members of that native tribe was a black slave. So the highest slave ownership of black slaves in America was by Native Americans. And by the way, Native Americans also imprisoned each other. And slavery did not end for Native Americans in 1865 when we passed the 13th Amendment because Native American tribes were independent nations. They actually ended slavery after 1865. So that's another thing that doesn't get covered today, but since slavery is a sin, it affects all races, not just white. Then point number 6 is white slavery. It's interesting that there were a number of white slaves in America. The first slave law passed in America is 1672. 1671, it allows you to own white slaves, black slaves, or Indian slaves. Again, you could own any kind of slave. And these were slaves that were freed in Louisiana at the end of the war, white slaves and black slaves. That was a part of what went on. So it was not confined just to black. Number 7, Muslim slave traders were very active in the slave trade. And they weren't as much concerned about race as they were about religion. And so they were looking for Christians, looking for non-Muslims to enslave. It didn't have to be a Christian. In the case of America, they took about 10,000 white Americans into slavery. And that's where a lot of the sex trade got started, was with white American women that they would capture and haul into slavery. So there were about 1.25 million slaves that the Muslims took in that slave period, that early slave period, including numbers from America. Number 8, Southern whites, most of them, contrary to popular belief, did not own slaves. 80% of Southern whites never owned a slave, and 92% of Americans never owned a slave. So instead of America being this huge racist nation, it had some slavery in it, sure did. We had a civil war over it. Had racism, sure did, because people are involved, but most Americans weren't involved. And so that's the other aspect. So getting a perspective on everything that's being said today, judge it back to what you have at the base here. So kind of wrapping this session up, slavery is without a primary color. Now in America, we try to make it white on black, and most slavery in America was white on black. but it's also black on black. It was also red on black. It was also black on white. It was everything. It was all things. So racism affects all human races. It's part of what goes on. And those are 8 facts to know about slavery. Now, a quick thing on the 1619 Project. 1619 Project has curriculums being used in all the states, but Black Lives Matter has joined them, Antifa's joined them. The founder of 1619 said, I'd be honored if all these riots and protests were called the 1619 protests and riots. So what's going on is consistent with what they believe and what they think. It's interesting, the 1619 Project takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. America was founded for slavery? What about the Pilgrims and the Puritans? What about William Penn? What about Roger Williams? All these other guys who founded colonies that were always anti-slavery. For example, in Massachusetts, there never was a time when blacks could not vote. At the time we ratified the U.S. Constitution, the northern states allowed blacks to vote. As a matter of fact, in Baltimore, 85% of blacks voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution in Baltimore. Southern states is a different deal. Northern states, we weren't founded to protect and promote slavery. That was something that happened in the South. It didn't happen in the North to the same degree in any way, shape, fashion, or form. This is where you get statements like U.S. Senator Tim Kaine, who said, unwisely, the United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it. Now that is a complete stupid statement. Has anybody ever heard of the book of Exodus in the Bible? Do you know what the book of Exodus is about? It's about people being delivered from slavery. Jews being delivered from Egyptian slavery. That's a long time before America ever existed, and yet America invented slavery. It didn't exist before us. That's nonsense. In the ancient Grecian world, 30% of all the ancient Grecian world were slaves. 40% of the Roman world were slaves. At the time Columbus landed in America, somewhere between 20 and 40% of Native American tribes enslaved other Native American tribes. Slavery was common across the world. America did not invent anything. As a matter of fact, we're one of the first to help end it. We were, again, number 1 on banning the slave trade and number 4 on banning slavery, and we do global work to still help end it today. So that's the perspective the media gives. It's just not right perspective. Slavery has affected all races, no question about it, but it's just not the way it's portrayed.